Jesse's wrists burn against the ropes as both twins circle him in the lamplight. Carson's voice cuts through the silence. One chokes you, one finishes inside of you. Those were the rules. Jesse's heart hammers. He chose this, but now, bound and trembling, he wonders if he's ready for what comes next. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. The dust hung thick in the air that afternoon, golden and choking, as 17-year-old Jesse Hartwell stood frozen in the doorway of the bunkhouse. His heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. The Crane twins stood before him, identical in every way except for the cruel twist of amusement in their eyes. Both tall, both sun-darkened, both wearing that same knowing smile that made Jesse's stomach drop like a stone down a well. Carson Crane leaned against the wooden post, arms crossed, his voice low and deliberate. One chokes you, one finishes inside of you. Those were the rules when you signed on to work this ranch, boy. Did you think we were joking? Jesse's throat went dry as desert bone. He had heard the whispers in town about the Crane Ranch, about what happened to the young men who took work there, but he had been desperate. His family's farm 3 months behind on payments. His mother's cough getting worse with every passing week. The twins paid triple what any other outfit offered, and Jesse had told himself the rumors were just that. Rumors. Nothing more than jealous talk from men who couldn't handle hard work. But standing here now, watching the way Carter Crane's gaze traveled down his body like fingers tracing a map, Jesse understood with sudden, terrifying clarity that every whispered warning had been true. The afternoon sun slanted through the gaps in the wood, casting bars of light across the dirt floor. Jesse could smell hay and leather and something else, something heavy and expectant that made the air feel too thick to breathe. His hands trembled at his sides, and he hated himself for it. Hated the way his body betrayed his fear. "You're new to this," Carter said, pushing off from the wall with the lazy confidence of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. "We can see it in the way you move, the way you can't quite meet our eyes. But that's all right, Jesse. We like them fresh. We like them not knowing what they're getting into until it's too late to turn back." Jesse's voice came out smaller than he intended. "I just came here to work, to earn money for my family." Carson laughed, a sound like gravel shifting. "They all say that at first. They all think they can keep their heads down, do their work, collect their pay, and walk away clean. But this ranch takes more than sweat, boy. It takes everything." The words settled over Jesse like a noose tightening, and he felt something shift inside him, something he didn't quite understand. Part of him wanted to run, to bolt through that door, and never look back. Consequences be damned. But another part, a part he had never acknowledged before, stayed rooted to that spot. Curiosity and something darker threading through his fear. "What if I refuse?" Jesse asked, and even he could hear how hollow the defiance sounded. The twins exchanged a glance, and in that moment of silent communication, Jesse saw a hunger that made his knees weak. Carter stepped closer, so close Jesse could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell whiskey and tobacco, and the musk of a man who worked hard under an unforgiving sun. "You could refuse," Carter said softly, his breath warm against Jesse's ear. "You could walk out that door right now, but we both know you won't. We saw it the moment you rode up to this place, saw the need in your eyes, the desperation, and beneath that, something else, something you don't even have a name for yet." Jesse's breath caught. His pulse thundered in his ears. The bunkhouse suddenly felt impossibly small, the walls pressing in, the air too hot, too heavy. He could feel both twins watching him, waiting, like wolves circling prey that had finally stopped running. Carson moved to his other side, flanking him, and Jesse was trapped between them, caught in a current he couldn't fight. "This is how it works," Carson said, his voice a low rumble. "You give yourself over to the experience. You let go of all those pretty ideas about who you are and what you want. You surrender to what you need." The word surrender hung in the air like smoke, and Jesse felt something crack open inside him, some wall he had built to keep the world at bay. He had spent his whole life being the good son, the responsible one, the boy who did what was expected and never asked questions. And where had it gotten him? standing in a bunkhouse, broke and desperate, with two men who saw right through every lie he had ever told himself. "I don't know what I need," Jesse whispered, and the confession felt like stepping off a cliff. Carter's hand came up, fingers brushing along Jesse's jaw, tilting his face up. The touch was gentle, almost tender, but Jesse could feel the steel beneath it, the promise of control. "That's why we're here," Carter said. "To show you, to teach you, to break you down and build you back up into something stronger." Jesse closed his eyes, his whole body trembling now, caught between terror and something else, something that felt like falling and flying all at once. When he opened them again, both twins were watching him with an intensity that stole his breath. "The choice is yours," Carson said. "Walk away now and you'll always wonder. Stay, and you'll never be the same." The sun continued its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the bunkhouse walls in shades of amber and blood. Jesse stood there, suspended between two lives, two versions of himself. The boy he had been rode up to this ranch that morning, innocent and naive. The man he might become stood on the other side of a decision that felt like jumping into dark water with no idea how deep it ran. He thought of his mother, of the farm, of all the reasons he had come here. But underneath those practical concerns, something else whispered, something that had been buried so long he had forgotten it was there. A hunger for something more than the narrow life that had been laid out for him. A need to be seen, to be wanted, to matter in a way that had nothing to do with duty or responsibility. Jesse took a breath, and in that moment made a choice that would change everything. "I'll stay," he said, and his voice didn't shake this time. The twins smiled, and Jesse saw his future written in that expression. It would be hard. It would push him past every limit he thought he had. It would strip away every comfortable lie and force him to face truths about himself he had spent 17 years avoiding. But as Carson's hand slid to the back of his neck and Carter stepped closer, blocking out the fading light, Jesse understood something fundamental. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you could do was the thing you needed most. The bunkhouse door swung shut, sealing them in shadow and possibility, and Jesse Hartwell stopped being the boy who had ridden up to the Crane Ranch looking for simple work. That boy was gone, burned away in the heat of two gazes that promised to consume him whole. And in the darkness, as the first touch landed like a brand, Jesse discovered that some kinds of destruction felt an awful lot like being born. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and sensation. Jesse woke before dawn, worked until his muscles screamed, and fell into his bunk so bone-tired he should have slept like the dead. But sleep proved elusive, his mind replaying moments in fragmented pieces that left him gasping in the darkness. The twins kept him close, always watching, always testing. They gave him the hardest tasks, the ones that left him covered in sweat and dirt, then waited to see if he would complain. He never did. Pride wouldn't let him, even as his hands blistered and his back ached. But the real test came when the sun went down and the ranch settled into its evening rhythm. That was when Carson would find him by the well, would hand him a tin cup of water, and let their fingers brush in the exchange. That was when Carter would appear in the barn where Jesse was putting away tack, would stand too close and speak in that low voice that made Jesse's skin prickle with awareness. They never pushed too far, never crossed the line into something Jesse couldn't handle. But they walked right up to that edge, again and again, until Jesse stopped flinching and started leaning in. One evening, as the sky burned orange and purple with sunset, Carson found Jesse sitting on the corral fence, watching the horses mill about in the dusty enclosure. The older man climbed up beside him, settling onto the weathered wood with the ease of someone who had sat on that same fence 1,000 times before. "You're doing better than I expected," Carson said. "Most boys your age either run screaming by the end of the first week or break down crying." Jesse kept his eyes on the horses. "I'm not most boys." "No," Carson agreed. "You're not. That's why we hired you." The words settled between them, heavy with implication. Jesse could feel Carson's gaze on the side of his face, could sense the older man waiting for something, though he couldn't quite figure out what. "Can I ask you something?" Jesse said finally. "Ask. Why me?" There were other ranch hands looking for work, older men, more experienced. Carson was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Jesse thought he might not answer. Then he reached out and tucked a strand of Jesse's hair behind his ear. The gesture so casual and intimate it made Jesse's breath catch. "Because you have something they don't," Carson said. "A hunger, not just for money or work, a hunger to become something more than what you are. We saw it the moment you walked into the ranch office, saw the way you looked at us, like we might be the answer to a question you didn't know how to ask." Jesse's throat tightened. "And are you?" "The answer." Carson smiled, and there was something almost sad in it. "We're not the answer, Jesse. We're the crucible, the fire that burns away everything false until only the truth remains." Before Jesse could respond, Carter appeared from the direction of the main house, carrying a bottle and 3 glasses. "Thought I might find you two out here," he said, climbing onto the fence on Jesse's other side. "Figured we could all use a drink." He poured generous measures of amber liquid, handed them out. Jesse took his glass with trembling fingers, acutely aware of being bracketed by the twins, caught between them as he had been that first day in the bunkhouse. "To new beginnings," Carter said, raising his glass. They drank, and the whiskey burned going down, settled hot in Jesse's stomach. The alcohol loosened something in him, made the world feel softer around the edges. He found himself relaxing, his shoulders dropping, the constant tension he carried easing just a fraction. "Tell us about yourself," Carter said. "The real you, not the story you tell everyone else." And so Jesse talked about his father dying when he was 12, about stepping into the role of man of the house before he was ready, talked about his mother's illness, about the farm slowly failing despite his best efforts, talked about the loneliness of being the only young man in a town full of families, always the outsider looking in. The twins listened without interrupting, and there was something powerful in being heard like that, in having his words received without judgment or pity. By the time he finished, the bottle was half empty, and the stars had come out, scattered across the sky like thrown diamonds. "You've been carrying too much for too long," Carson said quietly. "No wonder you're wound so tight." Carter leaned back, stretching his arms overhead. "We could help with that, if you'd let us." Jesse's pulse quickened. "How?" The twins exchanged one of their silent conversations, that wordless communication that came from sharing a womb and a life. Then Carter reached out, his hand settling on the nape of Jesse's neck, warm and steady. "By teaching you to let go," Carter said. "By showing you what it feels like to surrender control, to trust someone else to hold the weight for a while." Jesse's breath came faster now. He should pull away, should climb down from this fence and walk back to the safety of the bunkhouse. But Carson's hand found his lower back, a grounding pressure, and Jesse realized he didn't want safety. He wanted this, whatever this was, even if he couldn't quite name it. "What would that look like?" Jesse asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Carson's thumb traced slow circles on his spine. "It would look like you stopping for just one moment, stopping the worrying and the planning and the carrying. It would look like you feeling instead of thinking." Jesse closed his eyes, letting the sensations wash over him. The warmth of the twins on either side, the whiskey heat in his blood, the night air cool on his skin, the vast expanse of stars overhead, witnessing this moment that felt both terrifying and inevitable. "I don't know how," he admitted. "That's all right," Carter said, his fingers threading through Jesse's hair. "We do." And then they were moving, easing Jesse down from the fence, guiding him toward the barn. Jesse went willingly, his body moving on instinct, following where they led. The barn smelled of hay and horses, familiar and comforting. Carter lit a lantern, casting everything in warm golden light. They positioned Jesse in the center of the space, and he stood there feeling exposed and vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with being physically bare. The twins circled him slowly, their gazes heavy and assessing. "The thing you need to understand," Carson said, "is that power isn't about force. It's about trust, about giving yourself over to someone and knowing they'll take care of you. Jesse swallowed hard. And if I can't, then we'll teach you, Carter said simply. One lesson at a time. What Carson had said earlier came back to him then. One chokes you, one finishes inside of you. Jesse understood now that it wasn't a threat. It was a promise, a map of the territory they would explore together, if he was brave enough to take that first step. I'm scared, Jesse said, and the honesty of it felt like a gift he was giving them. Good, Carson said. Fear means you're alive, means you're paying attention. We don't want you numb. We want you present for every moment. Carter stepped closer, his hand coming to rest over Jesse's racing heart. Feel that? That's not just fear. That's anticipation, excitement. Your body knows what you need, even if your mind is still catching up. Jesse looked between them. These two, men who had upended his entire world in the space of a few weeks. They were offering him something he didn't fully understand, something that went beyond the physical into territories of surrender and trust he had never explored. But standing there in the warm lantern light, feeling the weight of their attention like a physical touch, Jesse made a decision. He had spent his whole life being careful, being responsible, being safe, and it had left him hollow and aching. Maybe it was time to try something different. Show me, he said, and his voice was steady now, certain. Teach me. The twins smiled, and Jesse saw his future in those expressions. It would be intense. It would push him to edges he didn't know existed. It would require a courage he wasn't sure he possessed. But as Carson's hand found the back of his neck and Carter's fingers traced his jawline, Jesse understood that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was admit you didn't have to be strong all the time. Sometimes survival meant learning to bend instead of break, to surrender instead of fight. And in that barn, with the horses shifting in their stalls and the lantern casting dancing shadows on the walls, Jesse Hartwell began to learn what it meant to truly let go. The first touch was gentle, almost reverent. Carson's hand on his shoulder, fingers spreading warmth through the worn fabric of Jesse's shirt. Carter moved behind him, close enough that Jesse could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the mix of leather and sage that clung to him. Breathe, Carson instructed, his voice barely above a whisper. Just breathe and feel. Jesse tried, but his lungs seemed to have forgotten how to work properly. Each inhale came shallow and quick, his chest tight with anticipation and something deeper, something that felt like standing on the edge of a cliff with nothing but darkness below. You're safe here, Carter murmured from behind, his breath warm against Jesse's neck. Nothing happens that you don't want. Nothing happens that we haven't prepared you for. But how could Jesse explain that he didn't know what he wanted? That his entire life had been about meeting other people's needs, fulfilling other people's expectations, and he had never stopped to ask himself what stirred in his own heart. The twins seemed to understand without words. They always did. Carson's hand moved from his shoulder to his face, cupping his jaw with a tenderness that made Jesse's throat ache. Look at me, he said. Jesse obeyed, lifting his gaze to meet those gray eyes that saw too much, understood too deeply. In that moment, stripped of pretense in the golden lantern light, Jesse felt more exposed than if he had been standing there without a stitch of clothing. You're fighting yourself, Carson observed. Fighting what you feel. Why? Because I don't understand it, Jesse admitted, his voice cracking. Because it scares me. Good, Carter said, his hands settling on Jesse's waist, anchoring him. Fear means you're paying attention, means you're alive to the moment. They stood like that for a long time. Jesse caught between them like a flame between two stones. The barn was silent except for the soft sounds of horses settling for the night, the creak of old wood adjusting to the cooling air. And in that silence, Jesse felt something begin to shift inside him. It started as a loosening in his chest, a release of tension he hadn't known he was carrying. Then it spread, traveling down his spine, into his limbs, until his whole body felt liquid and warm. He swayed slightly, and the twins steadied him, their hands sure and strong. That's it, Carson encouraged. Let it happen. Stop fighting. Jesse closed his eyes, surrendering to the sensation, and in the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw himself as if from a distance, a boy trying so hard to be a man, a soul trying so hard to be strong, a heart trying so hard not to break. But maybe breaking was exactly what he needed. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it brought a strange sort of peace. Because if he broke here, in this barn, held between these two men who had promised to catch him, then maybe he could be put back together differently, better, whole in a way he had never been before. When he opened his eyes again, tears were streaming down his face. He hadn't realized he was crying, but the evidence was there, wet tracks on his cheeks catching the lantern light. Carson wiped them away with his thumb, his expression soft. "Beautiful," he whispered. "You're so beautiful when you stop pretending." Jesse's breath hitched. Nobody had ever called him beautiful before. Useful, yes, hardworking, responsible, but never beautiful. Carter's arms wrapped around him from behind, pulling him back against a solid chest. "You've been performing strength for so long," he said, "but real strength is this, allowing yourself to be vulnerable, trusting someone else to hold the weight." The words unlocked something in Jesse, some final barrier crumbling. His knees buckled, and if not for their hands on him, he would have fallen. But they held him up, supported him, just as they had promised. "We've got you," Carson said. "We'll always have you." And Jesse believed them. Against all logic and reason, he believed them completely. The lessons started slowly, carefully. The twins were patient in a way that surprised Jesse, given their earlier intensity. They pushed, yes, but they also watched for his limits, pulling back when they sensed genuine distress rather than just nervousness. Carson taught him about breath, about how controlling your breathing could control everything else. They would stand in the barn or out by the corral, and Carson would place his hand on Jesse's chest, feel the rise and fall, and guide him into slower, deeper rhythms. "Just like that," Carson would murmur. "Let it fill you completely. Hold it. Now release." And Jesse would follow the instructions, feeling his racing heart, gradually slow, feeling the panic that lived in his chest like a caged animal begin to settle. Carter's lessons were different. He taught Jesse about stillness, about the power of remaining present in discomfort. He would have Jesse hold difficult positions, a bucket of water at arm's length or balanced on one leg, and just when Jesse thought he couldn't hold on any longer, Carter would appear at his side. "You're stronger than you think," Carter would say. "The pain you're feeling is just your mind telling you to quit, but your body can go further. Trust it." And Jesse would find reserves he didn't know he had, would push past the burning in his muscles to discover a strange sort of peace on the other side of endurance. The physical work on the ranch was brutal, but it paled in comparison to these private sessions. The twins were breaking him down systematically, stripping away every defense mechanism he had built over the years. And the terrifying thing was how much Jesse craved it, how desperately he needed this dismantling. One night, after a particularly long day, Jesse sat on the edge of his bunk, trying to process everything that was happening to him. His body ached in ways he had never experienced. His mind felt raw and exposed. But underneath the exhaustion was something else, something that felt almost like joy. The bunkhouse door opened, and both twins entered. It was late, well past the time when respectable ranch hands should be visiting each other's quarters, but nothing about this situation was respectable, and they all knew it. "Can't sleep?" Carson asked, though it wasn't really a question. Jesse shook his head. "Too much going on in here," he said, tapping his temple. Carter sat down beside him, while Carson leaned against the wall, and Jesse was struck again by how coordinated they were, how they moved like two parts of a single organism. "That's normal," Carter said. "You're changing, growing. That's uncomfortable." Jesse laughed, a hollow sound. "Is that what we're calling this? Growth?" Carson's expression grew serious. "What would you call it?" The question hung in the air, and Jesse realized he didn't have an answer. Or rather, He had too many answers, none of which felt adequate to describe what was happening to him. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "It feels like dying and being born at the same time." The twins exchanged a glance, and something passed between them that Jesse couldn't quite read. Then Carson pushed off the wall and came to crouch in front of Jesse, bringing them eye to eye. "That's exactly what it is," Carson said. "You're shedding the person you thought you had to be and discovering who you actually are. And that person is so much more than you ever imagined." Tears pricked at Jesse's eyes, sudden and unexpected. He blinked them back furiously, not wanting to appear weak, but Carter's hand came to rest on his shoulder, a steady presence. "Don't hold it back," Carter said gently. "Let it out. You've been holding everything in for so long. Let it go." And Jesse did. The tears came in a rush, along with sobs that shook his whole body. He cried for his father, dead these 5 years, for his mother, slowly fading, for the boy he had been, forced to become a man before he was ready, for every moment of loneliness and fear and desperate pretending. He cried for the farm that was slipping away despite his best efforts, for the childhood he never got to have, for the dreams he had buried so deep he had almost forgotten they existed, for every time someone had needed him to be strong when all he wanted was to fall apart. The sobs came harder now, tearing from his chest like they were pulling his insides out. His whole body convulsed with the force of grief too long denied. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only feel the overwhelming rush of everything he had locked away for years. And through it all, the twins held him. Carson's arms wrapped around his shoulders while Carter's hand rubbed slow circles on his back. They didn't try to quiet him or tell him it was all right. They just held space for the storm, letting it rage until it exhausted itself. When the tears finally began to subside, Jesse felt hollowed out, emptied of everything but a strange sort of clarity. His throat was raw, his eyes burned, and his head pounded. But underneath the physical discomfort was something else, something that felt almost like relief. "Let it all out," Carter murmured. "Every last drop. You've been carrying this alone for far too long." Jesse hiccuped, trying to catch his breath. His chest heaved with the effort, his lungs still learning how to work properly again. The twins held him through it, patient and steady, and Jesse marveled at how they seemed to know exactly what he needed. "I'm sorry," Jesse whispered when he could finally speak. "I didn't mean to fall apart like that." Carson pulled back just enough to look him in the eye. "Don't apologize for being human," he said firmly. "Don't apologize for feeling. That's the first thing we need to teach you. Emotions aren't weakness. They're strength." Jesse wiped his face with shaking hands, aware that he probably looked like absolute hell. His eyes had to be swollen, his face blotchy and wet, but when he looked at the twins, he saw no judgment in their expressions. Only understanding. "How long have you been holding that in?" Carter asked gently. Jesse thought about it. "Years," he admitted. "Since my father died, I guess. Someone had to be strong for my mother. Someone had to keep everything together. And you decided that someone had to be you," Carson said, "even though you were just a child yourself." The words hit Jesse like a physical blow, and fresh tears threatened to spill over. He had been 12 when his father died. 12 years old, and suddenly responsible for a farm, a grieving mother, and his own survival. He had never questioned it, never thought to ask if maybe it was too much for one person to carry. "You've been the man of the house for 5 years, Carter said, and Jesse could hear the sorrow in his voice. 5 years of putting everyone else first, of swallowing your own needs, of pretending you were stronger than you felt." Jesse nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. "Well, you're not alone anymore," Carson said, his voice fierce and certain. "You've got us now, and we're going to teach you that it's okay to need people. It's okay to let someone else carry the weight sometimes." The promise settled over Jesse like a warm blanket. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he didn't feel alone. Didn't feel like the world rested entirely on his shoulders. The twins held him through it all, their hands steady and sure, their presence an anchor in the storm of his grief. And when the tears finally subsided, leaving Jesse exhausted and hollow, he felt something shift. Felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. "Better?" Carson asked. Jesse nodded, wiping his face with the back of his hand. "Yeah. Actually, yeah." Carter handed him a handkerchief, and Jesse cleaned himself up, aware that he probably looked like hell, but somehow not caring. These men had seen him at his worst now. There was no point in pretending anymore. "What happens next?" Jesse asked, because surely this couldn't be the end of it. The twins shared another of their silent conversations, and then Carson spoke. "Now we show you what you're capable of. Now that you've cracked open, we can start filling you with something new." The words sent a shiver down Jesse's spine, equal parts anticipation and apprehension. "Fill me with what?" "Strength," Carter said. "Confidence. The knowledge that you can handle whatever comes your way." Carson's hand came up to cup Jesse's face, thumb brushing across his cheekbone. "And pleasure," he added, his voice dropping low. "We'll teach you about that too, about what your body can feel when you stop being afraid of it." Jesse's breath caught. He had never let himself think about pleasure, about desire. Those were luxuries he couldn't afford, distractions from the serious business of survival. But looking into Carson's eyes, feeling Carter's solid presence beside him, Jesse wondered what it might be like to explore those forbidden territories. "I'm ready," he said, and meant it. The twins smiled, and Jesse saw promise in those expressions. Tomorrow they would push him further. Tomorrow they would show him things about himself he had never dared to discover. Tomorrow the real lessons would begin. But tonight they simply stayed with him, their presence a comfort in the darkness. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Jesse slept deeply and dreamlessly, held safe between two forces that had promised to remake him entirely. When morning came, Jesse woke to find himself alone in the bunkhouse, the twins long gone to their daily work. But the imprint of their presence remained. And Jesse carried it with him as he dressed and headed out to face another day on the Crane Ranch. He moved differently this morning, could feel it in the way his body responded, looser somehow, less rigid, as if crying out all that pain had freed up space inside him for something new to grow. His reflection in the small mirror above the wash basin showed swollen eyes and a raw face, evidence of last night's breakdown. But there was also something else, a clarity in his gaze that hadn't been there before. Jesse splashed cold water on his face, feeling the shock of it wake him fully. The water ran down his neck, soaking into his collar, and he stood there dripping, staring at himself and trying to understand who this person was. Not the desperate boy who had arrived 3 weeks ago. Not the hollow shell who had been going through the motions of living without actually feeling alive. Someone in between. Someone being born. He thought about what the twins had said. About surrender. About trust. About learning to let go of control and allow someone else to hold the weight for a while. The concepts terrified him, even as they called to something deep in his soul. Outside, the ranch was coming to life. Jesse could hear the lowing of cattle, the whinny of horses, the distant shouts of men beginning their day's work. Normal sounds, ordinary sounds, but nothing about Jesse's experience here was normal or ordinary. He stepped out into the morning light, squinting against the brightness. The sun was already warm on his face, promising another scorching day. But Jesse felt different about it somehow. Less like a burden to be endured, and more like a challenge to be met. Carson spotted him from across the yard and raised a hand in greeting. Even from this distance, Jesse could see the question in his eyes. "Are you all right?" Jesse nodded, and Carson's face broke into a smile that made something warm bloom in Jesse's chest. He was different now. He could feel it in the way he moved, in the way he met the eyes of the other ranch hands without flinching. Something had fundamentally shifted inside him. Some barrier had crumbled, and he wasn't entirely sure what would rise from the rubble. But as he caught sight of Carson across the yard and felt that familiar pull in his chest, Jesse knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was exactly where he needed to be, learning exactly what he needed to learn. And whatever came next, he would face it with eyes wide open and heart fully present. The choice had been made. The path had been chosen. Now all that remained was walking it to wherever it might lead, trusting that the twins would guide him through the darkness into something resembling light. The second week on the Crane Ranch brought a heat wave that turned the prairie into a furnace. The air shimmered with mirages, and even the horses moved sluggishly through their paces. Jesse worked shirtless now, his pale skin bronzing under the relentless sun, sweat carving rivulets through the dust that coated him. He was mending fence line when Carter found him, the older man appearing like a specter through the heat haze. Jesse had learned to sense their approach now, some sixth sense that prickled along his spine whenever one of the twins drew near. "Boss wants you up at the house," Carter said, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of his hat. "Says it's time for your next lesson." Jesse's stomach dropped and soared simultaneously. The lessons had become more intense with each passing day, pushing him into territories of sensation and emotion he had never imagined existed. Last night, Carson had blindfolded him and led him through the barn, teaching him to navigate by sound and touch alone. The vulnerability of it, the absolute trust required, had left Jesse shaking and electrified. "What kind of lesson?" Jesse asked, setting down the wire cutters. Carter's smile was slow and dangerous. "The kind you've been waiting for." They walked back to the main house in silence, Jesse's heart thundering with each step. The house was larger than any he had ever been inside, 2 stories of solid timber and stone that spoke of old money and older power. He had only been inside once before, on the day he was hired, and the opulence had made him acutely aware of his own poverty. Carson waited for them in what appeared to be a study, leather-bound books lining the walls, a massive desk dominating one corner. But it was the other furniture that caught Jesse's attention. A large leather chair positioned in the center of the room, ropes coiled neatly on a side table, and something else, objects Jesse didn't recognize, but that sent a thrill of fear and anticipation through him. "Close the door," Carson said to his brother, and the click of the latch sounded like a judge's gavel, final and absolute. Jesse stood in the center of the room, acutely aware of being the focus of both twins' attention. They circled him slowly, appraising, and Jesse fought the urge to fidget under their scrutiny. "You've done well these past weeks," Carson said. "Better than we expected. You've shown strength, resilience, a willingness to learn." "But," Jesse prompted, because he could hear the unspoken word hanging in the air. "But you're still holding back," Carter finished. "Still keeping part of yourself locked away where we can't reach it." Jesse's jaw tightened. "I've given you everything." "No," Carson said gently. "You've given us what you think we want, what you think we need to see, but there's still a core of you that remains untouched, and that's what we're here to access today." The twins moved closer, flanking him, and Jesse felt the now familiar sensation of being caught between them, trapped and protected all at once. "We're going to ask things of you today that will be hard," Carter said. "Things that will make you want to run. But if you can push through that fear, if you can surrender completely, you'll find something on the other side that will change everything." Jesse's breath came faster. "What kind of things?" Carson's hand settled on the back of his neck, warm and commanding. "Trust exercises, endurance tests, situations designed to strip away every last defense you have." "And if I can't do it?" Jesse asked, hating the tremor in his voice. "Then we'll know you're not ready," Carter said simply, "and we'll take a step back. But I don't think that's going to happen. I think you're ready for this. I think you've been ready since the moment you walked onto this ranch." Jesse closed his eyes, centering himself the way Carson had taught him. He thought about why he had come here, about his mother and the farm and the desperate need for money. But underneath those practical reasons, he knew there was something else, a hunger to be transformed, to be unmade and remade into something stronger. "I'm ready," he said, opening his eyes. The twins shared one of their looks, and then Carter moved to the table with the ropes. Jesse watched him select a length, testing its strength, and something in Jesse's chest constricted. "We're going to restrain you," Carson explained, his voice matter of fact, "not to hurt you, but to remove choice from the equation, to force you into complete surrender." Jesse swallowed hard. For how long? As long as it takes, Carter said, returning with the rope. As long as you need to break through whatever wall you're still hiding behind. They guided Jesse to the chair, and he sat, his whole body trembling now. This was different from anything they had done before. This was crossing a line into territory that felt both terrifying and inevitable. Carson knelt in front of him, his gray eyes serious. "You can stop this at any time," he said. "All you have to do is say the word, and we'll untie you immediately. Do you understand?" Jesse nodded, not trusting his voice. "I need to hear you say it," Carson pressed. "I understand," Jesse managed. "I can stop this whenever I want." "Good," Carter said from behind him. "Because what we're about to do, it's going to feel like too much. It's going to push you past every limit you think you have. But that's the point. That's how you grow." They began with his wrists, securing them to the arms of the chair with practiced efficiency. The rope was soft but unyielding, and Jesse tested it instinctively, finding no give. The sensation was strange, not painful but definitively restrictive. Each loop of rope around his wrists felt like a promise, like a boundary being drawn that he couldn't cross even if he wanted to. His ankles came next, bound to the chair legs with the same careful precision. Jesse watched Carter work, fascinated despite his fear, by the way the older man's fingers moved with such confidence. Each knot was perfect, each loop exactly the right tightness. Not so tight it would cut off circulation, but tight enough that Jesse had absolutely no chance of escape. And then a final rope around his chest, pinning him firmly to the high back of the chair. This one felt different, more intimate somehow. It crossed over his heart, and Jesse could feel his pulse hammering against it with every beat. The physical pressure was grounding, paradoxically making him feel more present in his body, even as it restricted his movement. Jesse's breathing had gone shallow and rapid. He was completely immobilized, utterly at their mercy, and the reality of it crashed over him in waves. Every muscle in his body wanted to fight, to struggle against the restraints. But he forced himself to remain still, to trust the process even as panic clawed at his throat. "This is what it feels like to have no choice," Carson said, standing back to assess his work. "This is what it's like to be completely at someone else's mercy. How does it make you feel?" Jesse's first instinct was to lie, to say he was fine, that he could handle it. But the twins had taught him better than that. They wanted his truth, all of it, no matter how ugly or frightening. "Terrified," Jesse admitted, his voice shaking. "Like I'm trapped, like I can't breathe." "But you are breathing," Carter pointed out gently. "Your body knows what to do even when your mind is panicking. Trust it." Jesse focused on his breath, trying to slow the frantic pace. In through his nose, hold, out through his mouth. The rope around his chest rose and fell with each breath, a constant reminder of his confinement. But as he focused on the rhythm, something began to shift. The panic didn't disappear, but it became more manageable, less overwhelming. "Good," Carson said, approval warm in his voice. "You're learning. The fear doesn't have to control you. You can feel it and still function." "How do you feel?" Carson asked, standing back to assess his work. "Vulnerable," Jesse admitted. "Scared. Exposed." "Good," Carter said. "That's exactly where we need you, because it's only when you're stripped of all your defenses that we can see who you really are." They stepped away then, moving to opposite sides of the room, and Jesse was left alone in the center, bound and exposed. The silence stretched, broken only by his own ragged breathing and the distant sound of wind against the windows. "Tell us what you're afraid of," Carson said finally. Jesse's mind raced, everything he wanted to say, but he forced himself to focus, to dig deeper. "I'm afraid of losing control, of being helpless." "You already are helpless," Carter pointed out. "The ropes have ensured that. So what's really scaring you?" Jesse's throat tightened. "I'm afraid of what you might do to me." "And what do you think we might do?" Carson's voice was gentle, curious. The tears came then, hot and unexpected. "I don't know," Jesse choked out. "That's what terrifies me. I don't know what you want from me or what I'm willing to give. The twins moved simultaneously, returning to his sides. Carson's hand found his face, thumb wiping away tears. "We want your truth," he said. "All of it. Every hidden part. Every secret shame. Every desperate need you've buried." Jesse's breath hitched. "I don't know how to give you that." "Yes, you do," Carter said, his hand settling over Jesse's racing heart. "You've been giving it to us in pieces all along. Now we just need the rest." They began asking questions then, simple at first, about his childhood, his dreams, his fears. But gradually, they dug deeper, pushing into territories Jesse had never explored even in the privacy of his own mind. "Have you ever wanted someone?" Carson asked. "Really wanted them?" Jesse's face burned. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do," Carter said. "I think you've spent your whole life pushing those feelings down, telling yourself they were wrong or impossible. But they're still there, aren't they? Still burning under the surface." The honesty was dragged from Jesse like confession from a sinner. "Yes," he whispered. "Yes, they're there." "Tell us about them," Carson encouraged. "Tell us what you want." And Jesse did, haltingly at first, then in a rush, the words spilling out like water from a broken dam. He talked about loneliness, about watching other people connect while he remained always on the outside, about the hunger for touch, for intimacy, for mattering to someone in a way that went beyond duty or obligation. He talked about late nights lying awake, listening to the sounds of the world outside his window, and feeling like he existed in a parallel universe where nothing quite made sense. About the desperate ache of wanting someone to see him, really see him, past all the masks and pretenses. He talked about the shame he had carried for so long, the belief that something was fundamentally wrong with him because he didn't fit the mold everyone expected, about trying so hard to be normal, to want the right things, to feel the right ways, and always falling short. He talked about the twins themselves, about how they had invaded his thoughts from the first moment, about lying awake at night replaying their touches, their words, wondering what it would be like to give himself over completely to their control, about the fear and desire that warred in his chest every time they looked at him. He talked about his body, about the shame he felt about his own desires, about needs he couldn't name because he had no framework to understand them, about wanting things he had been taught were wrong, about craving experiences he didn't have words for. The confession went on, pulling from Jesse truths he hadn't known he was carrying. Each word felt like a stone being lifted from his chest, each admission a release of pressure he had been holding for years. He talked until his voice went hoarse, until there was nothing left inside him but hollow echoing emptiness. And through it all, the twins listened without judgment, without interruption. They just let him speak, let him purge himself of every secret shame and hidden fear. When Jesse finally fell silent, exhausted and wrung out, the room felt different somehow. Lighter, as if his confession had cleared the air of something toxic. The confession exhausted him, left him wrung out and hollow. But when he finally fell silent, Jesse felt lighter than he had in years. The secrets he had carried for so long no longer weighed him down. "Better?" Carson asked softly. Jesse nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. "You're beautiful like this," Carter said, and there was something almost reverent in his voice. Completely open, nothing held back. They left him there for a while longer, bound and vulnerable, as they moved around the room. Jesse could hear them discussing him in low voices, could feel their eyes on him, assessing. And strangely, instead of feeling objectified, he felt seen in a way he never had before. When they finally returned to untie him, Jesse's limbs were stiff and his mind felt scraped raw. But as the ropes fell away and circulation returned with painful tingles, he understood something fundamental had shifted. Carson helped him to his feet, steadying him when his legs threatened to give out. Carter appeared with water, and Jesse drank gratefully, his throat parched from confession. "You did well," Carson said, and the simple praise made something warm bloom in Jesse's chest. "How do you feel?" Carter asked. Jesse considered the question seriously, like I've been turned inside out, like everything I thought I knew about myself was wrong. The twins smiled. "Good," they said in unison. They guided him to a sofa along one wall, and Jesse sank into it gratefully. His body felt boneless, exhausted in a way that went beyond physical fatigue. The twins sat on either side of him, their presence anchoring. "What now?" Jesse asked, because surely there had to be more. "Now you rest," Carson said. "Let what happened today sink in. Process it. But tomorrow," Carter added, "we continue, because this was just the beginning." Jesse's stomach fluttered. "The beginning of what?" "Of teaching you what real surrender looks like," Carson said. "Of showing you what you're capable of when you stop fighting yourself." They stayed there as the afternoon light shifted across the room, the three of them in comfortable silence. And Jesse felt something he had never expected to feel in this place. Safe. Protected. Cared for in a way that had nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with genuine connection. When the light began to fade, Carter stood and offered Jesse his hand. "Come on," he said. "Let's get you fed and back to the bunkhouse." Jesse let himself be pulled to his feet, swaying slightly. Carson steadied him with a hand on his lower back, and together they walked through the house and out into the evening air. The walk back to the bunkhouse passed in a haze. Jesse was aware of the twins on either side of him, of their quiet conversation that washed over him without penetrating. His mind felt too full and too empty at the same time, struggling to process everything that had happened. At the bunkhouse door, Carson stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. "You should know," he said, "that what we're doing here, it's not something we take lightly. We've been watching you since before you arrived, making sure you were the right fit." Jesse's brow furrowed. "What do you mean, before I arrived?" Carter smiled. "We own half the businesses in your town, Jesse, including the bank that holds your family's mortgage. We knew about your situation, about your desperation, and we knew you'd come looking for work eventually." The revelation should have angered Jesse, should have made him feel manipulated, but instead, he felt oddly comforted. They had chosen him, specifically. Out of all the desperate young men in the territory, they had selected him. "Why me?" he asked. "Because we saw something in you," Carson said. "A strength you don't even recognize yet, a capacity for growth that most people never access. And because," Carter added, "we knew you could handle what we needed to teach you." Jesse looked between them, these two men who had upended his entire existence. "What is it you need to teach me?" "How to be free," Carson said simply. "How to stop living in fear and start living in truth." They left him then, walking back toward the main house, and Jesse entered the bunkhouse alone. He stripped off his dusty clothes and washed in the basin, scrubbing away the day's sweat and grime. But no amount of washing could erase the feeling of the ropes on his wrists, the memory of complete helplessness. As he lay in his bunk that night, Jesse replayed everything that had happened. The fear, the vulnerability, the strange peace that had come after confession, and underneath it all, a growing certainty that he was exactly where he needed to be. The next morning dawned clear and hot, another scorching day in a string of them. Jesse woke to find a note slipped under his door. "North pasture, noon, come alone." He spent the morning in a state of nervous anticipation, going through his chores mechanically, while his mind raced ahead to whatever awaited him. When the sun reached its zenith, Jesse saddled his horse and rode out to the north pasture. The twins were waiting for him by a small creek, the only water source in this part of the ranch. They had spread a blanket in the shade of a cottonwood tree, and as Jesse approached, he saw they had brought food and water. "Hungry?" Carter asked, gesturing to the spread. Jesse dismounted and joined them on the blanket, suddenly ravenous. They ate in companionable silence, and Jesse marveled at how natural this felt, how easy, as if sitting by a creek with two men who had systematically stripped away every defense he possessed was the most ordinary thing in the world. After the meal, Carson leaned back on his elbows, studying Jesse with an intensity that made his skin prickle with awareness. "You've been here 3 weeks now," he said. "How are you finding the work?" "Hard," Jesse admitted, "but satisfying in ways I didn't expect. It's not just the physical labor. It's everything else. The lessons, the challenges, the way you push me to be more than I thought I could be." Carter smiled, a rare, genuine expression that transformed his usually serious face. "That's what we hope to hear. Most men can handle the physical work. It's the rest of it that separates those who belong here from those who don't. And do I belong? Jesse asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. The twins exchanged one of their meaningful looks, that silent communication that spoke of years spent as two halves of a whole. Then Carson sat up, his expression growing serious. That's actually what we need to talk to you about, he said, because you've complicated things in a way we didn't anticipate. Jesse's stomach dropped. Am I being sent away? No, Carter said quickly. God, no. The opposite, actually. That's the problem. Jesse's confusion must have shown on his face because Carson continued. This arrangement we have, hiring young men like you and teaching them, it's always been temporary. A few months at most. We give them what they need to grow stronger, then send them back into the world with the tools to survive. But, Jesse prompted, sensing the unspoken words. But we don't want you to leave, Carter said bluntly, his dark eyes locked on Jesse's face. And that's never happened before. Not in all the years we've been doing this. The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Jesse's heart raced, hope and fear warring in his chest. What are you saying? We're saying you matter to us, Carson said, his voice rough with emotion. More than any of the others. More than we planned or expected. You've gotten under our skin, Jesse Hartwell, and we can't just let you walk away. Jesse looked between them, seeing vulnerability in their expressions that he had never witnessed before. These two powerful men who had seemed so untouchable, so completely in control, were revealing their own need, their own fear of loss. I don't understand, Jesse said, though his heart was beginning to comprehend what his mind hadn't caught up to yet. Why me? What makes me different? Carson reached out, his hand finding Jesse's and gripping tight. Because you fight for every inch of ground. Because you're brave even when you're terrified. Because you look at us like we might actually be worth something beyond our money and our power. And because, Carter added, his voice soft, when you broke down crying in that bunkhouse, when you let us see you at your most vulnerable, it cracked something open in us too. Made us realize how tired we are of being alone. And the other aspects of your time here? Carter prompted. Jesse's cheeks warmed. Challenging, confusing, transformative. Good words, Carson said, all of them accurate, but there's something we need to discuss. Jesse's stomach tightened. Am I doing something wrong? No, Carter assured him. You're doing everything right. That's actually the problem. Jesse's confusion must have shown on his face because Carson sat up, his expression serious. The thing is, Jesse, this was supposed to be temporary. We hire young men like you, teach them what they need to learn, then send them on their way with enough money to solve whatever crisis brought them to us. But, Jesse prompted, sensing there was more. But we don't want you to leave, Carter said bluntly. We've grown attached to you in a way that's never happened before. The confession hung in the air between them, and Jesse's heart raced. What are you saying? We're saying we want you to stay, Carson said. Not as a ranch hand, but as something more, something permanent. Jesse's mind reeled. Stay. But what about my mother? The farm? We can help with all of that, Carter said. The mortgage on your family's farm, we'll forgive it. Your mother's medical care, we'll pay for it. We have the resources to solve all your practical problems. And in return? Jesse asked, because nothing came free in this world. In return, Carson said, you give us yourself, completely. You become ours in every sense that matters. Jesse looked between them. These two men who had seen him at his most vulnerable, who had pushed him past every limit he thought he had. The practical part of his brain screamed that this was insane, that he barely knew them, that he should run as far and fast as he could. But the rest of him, the part that had been awakened these past weeks, knew a different truth. He had been searching his whole life for a place to belong, for people who saw him as more than a collection of obligations. And somehow, impossibly, he had found it here. I need time to think, Jesse said. Of course, Carter said. Take all the time you need. We're not going anywhere. They spent the rest of the afternoon by the creek, talking about nothing and everything. The twins told him about their own journey, about inheriting the ranch from their father and building it into something more, about the loneliness of power and wealth, about searching for someone who could match their intensity. And Jesse talked about his dreams, the ones he had buried beneath responsibility and duty, about wanting to matter, to be seen, to be chosen for who he was rather than what he could provide. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, they rode back to the ranch together, and Jesse felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Stay or go, safety or possibility, the known or the unknown. That night he lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling, running through every angle. If he stayed, he would be giving up any pretense of a normal life. He would be binding himself to these two men in ways that society would never understand or accept. But if he left, he would be walking away from the first place he had ever felt truly alive, from the first people who had ever pushed him to become more than he thought possible. The answer, when it came, was surprisingly simple. Jesse rose before dawn, dressed quickly, and walked to the main house. He knocked firmly, and Carson answered, looking unsurprised to see him. "I'll stay," Jesse said without preamble. "Whatever this is, whatever it becomes, I'm in." Carson's smile was like sunrise, warm and brilliant. He pulled Jesse inside and called for his brother. Carter appeared from deeper in the house, his hair mussed from sleep, and his eyes widened when he saw Jesse. "He's staying," Carson announced. Carter crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled Jesse into an embrace that stole his breath. "Welcome home," he murmured against Jesse's hair. And Jesse, who had spent 17 years feeling like a stranger in his own life, finally understood what that word meant. Home wasn't a place, it was people. It was belonging. It was being seen and chosen and claimed. The twins pulled back, their hands still on Jesse's shoulders, grounding him. "This is going to be hard," Carson warned. "People will talk, judge, try to tear us apart." "Let 'em," Jesse said with more confidence than he felt. "I'm not afraid anymore." The weeks that followed were a blur of change and challenge. The twins made good on their promises, paying off the farm's mortgage and arranging for a doctor to treat Jesse's mother. They also began integrating Jesse into the ranch's operations, teaching him the business side alongside the physical work. But more importantly, they continued his education in other matters, teaching him about trust and surrender, about power dynamics and emotional vulnerability. Each lesson pushed Jesse further into himself, forcing him to confront truths he had spent years avoiding. There were hard days, days when Jesse doubted his choice, days when the weight of judgment from the outside world pressed down like a physical force. But the twins were always there, steady and sure, reminding him why he had chosen this path. And gradually, Jesse began to transform, not into someone different, but into a fuller version of himself. The scared boy who had ridden up to the ranch 3 months ago was gone, replaced by a young man who knew his worth, who understood his desires, who wasn't afraid to claim what he needed. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the prairie, Carson turned to Jesse. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "Choosing this life?" Jesse considered the question seriously. He thought about everything he had given up, the safety of convention, the comfort of anonymity, the simple path everyone expected him to follow. But he also thought about what he had gained: purpose, connection, a love that transcended anything he had imagined possible. "Not for a second," Jesse said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Carter reached over and laced his fingers through Jesse's while Carson's hand found his shoulder. And sitting there between them, Jesse felt complete in a way he never had before. The ranch hands had stopped whispering weeks ago, either accepting the situation or learning to keep their opinions to themselves. The town folk still talked, but Jesse found he didn't care. Let them gossip, let them judge. They didn't understand what the three of them had built together, and Jesse had no obligation to explain it. As fall approached, bringing cooler temperatures and the promise of harvest, Jesse stood at the fence line, looking out over land that had become his home. He thought about the desperate boy who had come here seeking only money. That boy would never have imagined this outcome, would never have believed that losing everything could lead to gaining what mattered most. Behind him, he heard the twins approaching, their footsteps familiar as his own heartbeat. He turned to face them, these two men who had seen past every mask he wore to the truth beneath. "Ready?" Carson asked, because they were riding out to check the northern boundary. "Always," Jesse replied, swinging himself into the saddle. They rode out together, three figures moving across the vast prairie, and as the wind carried the scent of dry grass and distant rain, Jesse understood that he had finally found what he had been searching for all along. Not salvation from his circumstances, but transformation through them. Not escape from himself, but acceptance of who he truly was. The ranch sprawled behind them, solid and enduring, and ahead lay nothing but open sky and endless possibility. Jesse had learned many things in his time here, about trust and surrender, about strength and vulnerability, about the power of being truly seen. But the most important lesson was this: sometimes the bravest thing you could do was say yes to the unknown, to leap into uncertainty with nothing but faith that the fall would be worth it. Jesse had taken that leap, and he had discovered that on the other side of fear lived a truth more powerful than anything he had known before. He was exactly where he belonged, not because circumstance had forced him here, but because he had chosen it, chosen them, chosen himself. And in that choosing, Jesse Hartwell had finally become free. The sun climbed higher as they rode, painting the world in shades of gold and amber. Jesse rode between the twins, their steady presence on either side a reminder of how far he had come. The scared, desperate boy who had shown up at this ranch seeking only survival had been transformed into a man who understood the difference between merely existing and truly living. Every hoofbeat seemed to echo the rhythm of his new life. Every breath of wind carried the scent of possibility. Jesse had spent 17 years living in fear, in smallness, in the prison of other people's expectations. And in just a few short months, the twins had shown him there was another way. Carson glanced over at him, and Jesse caught the small smile playing at the corner of his mouth, the softness in his eyes that was reserved only for private moments. "What?" Jesse asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Just thinking about that first day," Carson said, his voice warm with memory. "How you stood in that bunkhouse trying so hard not to shake, trying to be braver than you felt." "I was terrified," Jesse admitted freely now, the shame of that fear long since burned away by the fire of transformation. "I thought you were going to destroy me." "We did," Carter said with a slight smile. "We destroyed who you thought you had to be, and look what we found underneath." Jesse felt his throat tighten with emotion. He had spent so long believing he was weak, believing his sensitivity was a flaw, his emotions a liability. But the twins had shown him that those very qualities were his greatest strengths, that the capacity to feel deeply, to be vulnerable, to surrender, required a courage most people never found. "You were brave," Carter corrected, as if reading his thoughts. "Bravery isn't the absence of fear. It's feeling it and moving forward anyway. It's standing in the fire and letting it burn away everything false until only truth remains." They reached the northern boundary, where the Crane land met unclaimed territory, and dismounted to check the markers. As Jesse worked alongside the twins, repairing a section of fence, he marveled at how natural this felt, how right. That night, as they made camp under a sky full of stars, the three of them sat around the fire sharing stories and whiskey. Jesse listened to the twins talk about their plans for the ranch, about the future they were building, and realized with a start that he was part of that future now. Not a temporary fixture, but a permanent foundation. "Tell us something," Carter said as the fire burned low. "Something you've never told anyone." Jesse thought for a moment, then spoke. "I used to think I was broken," he said quietly, "that there was something fundamentally wrong with me because I didn't want what everyone else wanted, didn't feel what I was supposed to feel. And now," Carson prompted. "Now I understand I was never broken," Jesse said. "I was just waiting for the right people, the right place, the right moment to become who I was always meant to be." The twins were silent for a long moment, and when Jesse looked up, he saw something profound in their eyes. Understanding, recognition, love, though none of them had spoken that word yet. "You saved us too," Carter said finally. "We didn't realize how empty this place was until you filled it." The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. And Jesse understood then that this wasn't a one-sided arrangement. He hadn't just been taken in and transformed. He had given them something they needed just as desperately. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks spiraling up toward the infinite stars. And Jesse felt a peace settle over him that he had never known before. This was home, not the ranch itself, but the connection between them, the trust they had built, the truth they had uncovered together. As they bedded down for the night, the twins flanking him as always, Jesse stared up at the vast expanse of sky and made a silent promise. He would never take this for granted, would never forget how close he had come to missing this entirely, would spend every day earning the gift he had been given, the gift of being truly known, truly seen, truly chosen. And as sleep claimed him, Jesse's last thought was one of profound gratitude, for desperation that had driven him here, for courage that had made him stay, for these two men who had seen past everything he pretended to be, to the truth of who he was. The sun would rise tomorrow on the Crane Ranch, and Jesse Hartwell would wake not as a hired hand or a project or a temporary fixture, but as someone who belonged, completely, utterly, without question or reservation. He had come here seeking salvation from poverty, but he had found something infinitely more valuable. He had found himself, and in finding himself, he had found home.